Gian Manik is an artist based in Nam whose practice is defined by an ongoing investigation into the boundaries of representation. Trained as a portrait painter in oils from a young age, Gian's current practice blurs the lines between figuration and abstraction.
His recent works include Mariflage, in which painted drop sheets were hung from a lighting rig to cover the ceiling at bus projects, and a collaboration with local fashion label Verna titled Joint Venture, with 40 original paintings translated onto clothing.
Please welcome to the discussion today, Gian Manik.
Hello.
Hi. Nice to finally meet you, but yes, thank you. Thank you for joining us today for this talk. So this talk's, I guess, for our show with Bus Projects, Bus TV called Taking Care, but also for the AICCM conference, paintings, special interest group, sorry. So on that basis, I guess we're really interested in your process and the materials that you use, and I guess its interactions with conservation. So thank you for joining us today. But first off, we just wanted to just get an idea of what your materials you use in your practice. How do you use them? What's your relationship with the materials that you use?
Yeah, I think going to art school, I felt like I've been trained as a painter for my, the majority of my life. My mum was a painter and her dad was a painter too. So I sort of come from this quite, funny lineage. And this kind of history of this Dutch sort of canon of, painting. That's my mother's side. So I think going to art classes and stuff like that and being quite interested when I was a kid, and from oils from a very young age. I really don't like acrylic that much. I don't know why. I think these days, probably for the medium, it can sort of imitate sort of effects that oils get. But I've always just been sort of quite a purist with that sort of medium. But going to art school, I sort of did a bit of everything. And I didn't really want to be taught painting there. So I did sculpture. And then materially, I sort of, I guess, work through all different types of processes to sort of best execute concepts that I, have regarding from I guess, it was always the body. And then that sort of kind of progressed into portraiture and then self-portraiture. And from then, representation in terms of the concept of representing self, I guess, manifested into how to represent through oil paints. So I guess in the last maybe, I'd say probably since early 2000, mid 2000s, I've just focused only on using paint because I thought that what I was doing was the same, or I guess working through medium, doing the same thing. So if I just really consolidated that and then worked just with oil paints, it would make more sense to me than have to represent that through different mediums. So that was a really long answer. But yeah, I guess I just work with mostly oil paints. And then the way I was taught by this mentor when I was quite young was to just mix primary colours and not use black. So I only really use primary red, yellow, blue and white for everything that I make. I do have a box of old shitty sort of paints that I've gotten from an old boss, but I don't know, I don't really tend to use those. It's not really part of my process. And then I guess it's exercising a muscle. If you can sort of just start doing that over and over again, that just becomes tacit. So it doesn't really make more sense for me to sort of confuse materiality by adding more and more to it, because I am quite messy as well, so.
That's fantastic. And yeah, I imagine that having such a limited base of colors to work with, you get to know the materials so much better because, your sort of color theory and figuring out all of the huge variations that can come from just those primary colors is fantastic. In terms of, I suppose, the traditional structure of an oil painting, canvas, priming, gesso, paint, varnish, do you like to follow that sort of linear way of using it? I'm thinking more of your work at bus projects, which, seems to not have a priming and, not be stretched and sort of, still working with traditional materials, but then using them in different ways.
Yeah, I feel like it's almost like the same sort of thing that I was talking about with using different, what am I trying to say? Mediums to represent concept. Now I sort of use different kind of techniques and armatures to represent, whatever self, body, still life, landscape. So it's kind of blown out for me to sort of come up with an idea and then I guess see how to best show that. And then also, labor, like what I can afford, what I can be bothered doing, I think that something for me that I've realized in the past maybe 5 years is that to have like a dynamic practice with that is kind of conceptually driven, I don't think I can limit myself with doing one particular thing over and over again. And that's definitely part of my personality too, because I've got like a really short attention span. So sometimes when I learn how to do something, I'll finish it and then do something else rather than have to sort of do, several iterations of the same thing. So when I have an exhibition, it can be quite disparate, like imagery wise and materiality as well. In saying that, I do, work on traditional structures and primed linen, cotton, raw, drop sheets, unprimed. And I think that the kind of execution sort of does follow through with what I'm trying to say for the actual exhibition too. So I'm working on some stuff at the moment and it's so sort of traditional in terms of this quite, golden age style of treating a surface and then kind of doing washes somewhat to, build up layers of paint to have quite realistic depictions of particularly flowers at the moment. Whereas the stuff for bus was just these really shitty drop sheets that I'd have in my studio that were quite, almost decomposing and stitched together with twine. None of the surfaces were really primed unless I really wanted to sort of show something that had more of a landscape within it. So that's kind of, I don't know. I guess also, I do show with a commercial gallery. So, there's, they're so sort of welcoming with how I execute. And, I guess I don't I'm not particularly wanting to do sort of freezers directly on the wall in the gallery and then painting everything. But, the bus project show was quite different to the next exhibition that I had with Sutton. I guess I try to work quite differently and dynamically with materials to best execute concept. Yeah.
So do you use for the paint medium in a different way, considering how it's going to be reproduced? So, for example, say the Werner collection, you painted paintings that then got reproduced on clothing. Did you paint it in a different way or produce imagery in a different way or use materials or techniques in a different way, knowing that it would be reproduced, digitally scanned and reproduced?
I think that considering the fabrics and the details that I assumed the garments were going to be created from, I'm not really very good at, I guess in terms of a collaboration with fashion and then creating textiles, it was important for me to sort of see that they were not like trying to be too realistic to mar or kind of interfere with painting techniques that could be transported onto fabric, if that makes sense. So if there's a brush stroke, it was big enough to be printed on the fabric, and the fabric had a fine enough weave to then show that detail. So some of the paintings that I was doing that I had done were quite, I guess, gestural and large work. So then they were kind of, I guess, shown one-to-one scale-wise, and not blown up to kind of confuse detail or shrunk to not be able to see any. But I guess, yeah, for that was quite like, I was just working on really essentially just scraps of canvas. I do these kind of almost collaged works, and they do sort of, they do what does it say? It like indicate a way of how I can work on something in the future, where, I was working left to right, top down, because I was doing it on a flat surface during lockdown last year, just in the kitchen, like where I am now. So I guess, yeah, like for me with that work, it was more about just kind of doing these almost like vignettes of small works quite quickly. And I would do like 3 or 4 if I had a good day in the morning, and then, yeah, I guess put them all together, give them to the designer, who then created this sort of fabric with we call it a salon hang. So it sort of was quite busy in terms of its placement.
Yeah, I suppose that's really interesting, and it sort of leads us into the conservation aspect of like, obviously you, especially over the last year, have been really prolific in, painting every day, doing things quite quickly. So just in terms of like your thoughts on conservation of your work, or, what's the future for these pieces that, they've got the digital file and,
I guess a lot of the work for the Verna stuff, sorry, Sutton, I kind of like did kind of give away, because they were sort of, as like a whole sort of collective of drawings, I'd call them, or ideas. They were sort of hard to kind of then kind of create commercial, some of them were like this big. So I think that in terms of, maybe I'm, an interesting sort of case with this sort of stuff, but like I don't really have the best appreciation of like how I particularly conserve work. So for me, it's really good to kind of get them out of my space, so then someone else can deal with that. I think, I also worked in install before, and the way that you handle your own work as opposed to other people's is just so different. And, I've got friends, like my housemate who's also a artist, you walk into the studio and you're like walking on top of works, and, like funny things like that I don't think are particularly funny. But I guess like in the past, I've had a bit of run-ins with, in this particular house, mold as well. So I have had large works that were rolled up from maybe 4 or 5 years ago on the floor that had kind of like mold going through it. So there were large works that, people were interested in sort of seeing or buying through the gallery, and they couldn't. And they were quite prolific ones as well, like 4 by 2 meter canvases.
Wow.
That were, had mold all over them. So that was a bit of a learning curve for me to not put it. But and I did have, times when I was quite prolific last year and kind of creating all the time and not really having enough sort of space, especially because a lot of them weren't stretched canvases, so they'd be sort of pinned or tacked to a wall or just lying on the floor, and that did sort of have some mold attached to some of these works. But I was lucky enough to sort of get it early on, and sometimes bleach the back of the work, or to actually wipe it off and then get a little vacuum cleaner, and doing a bit of conservation research myself. Yeah. So that was a bit like, yeah, it's safer for me to get rid of my work as soon as I do it. So, the gallery that I'm with are good like that. But I guess it also just has quite a lot to do with, my personality and the way that I paint. There can be this sort of, like, more recently, this somewhat slowed down appreciation of treating a surface in a really traditional, careful way, as opposed to being sort of quite erratic and uncareful with other works. And that, I don't really consider one better or worse than the other. But it's just, I guess, like I said, another sort of more dynamic way of having a practice which can be sort of quite, on a bit of a spectrum.
Definitely. That sort of brings to mind, I was looking through your Instagram a while back and noticed there was like a sort of Belgian collective that you had sent a mouldy painting to, and I think they, I'm not quite sure what their sort of, aim or content was, but I think they were leaving it outside on a rooftop over winter to sort of see how that, it's just like, I think the conservation spectrum, it doesn't, not everything needs to be saved necessarily, but if things can have a different life.
And also, to me, I wouldn't say this is part of my practice necessarily, but I think that it can definitely be somewhat part of a work or a series of works where the idea of value comes into play, and then also this transience and then a destruction of something too. So that work is supposed to be destroyed because it began that path without me intending it to, by being somewhat moldy, because the work was one of those ones that was in the basement. So I thought that if there was like an element of something sort of aging and weathering, which is what the project was called for the curators over in Helsinki, that it was important for it to sort of almost not have, or have like a very finite kind of, conceptual development of what it is. So, it almost like keeps painting itself until it's destroyed, which I think is quite cool.
And it's almost like the works are like a performative aspect. Like you initiate a process by painting on them, but they have another life. And I think there was in one of your interviews, it was about some mural that you created with a community group with some kids or something, and then it all got broken up and cut up and split up into different works that got sent to friends and whoever. And that's kind of interesting that it was one work that evolved into a series of other works. And is that kind of a thing that's important to your process?
For me, it was an important part of that process, not my process. I also just had this giant, because that work was 10 meters long and it was so community and collaborative in its sort of fission that I think that it didn't really make sense. I don't really sell a lot of work into collections and universities or anything like that. So I think that it was important for me to get rid of it, which, doesn't, I think a lot of people can kind of, be a bit sort of intimidated by that supposed sort of frivolous, way of working through a work. But I also wanted to make money, and I didn't want this giant thing, so I just cut it up and gave a lot of people sort of were interested in buying that before I signed with the gallery that I was with. So I think for that it was kind of, it's the same as the bus work, that's sort of folded in and tucked away in Sutton's storeroom, and Irene, the owner of the gallery, sort of, it was kind of cool how she didn't really hesitate to kind of ask, but almost sort of infer that could also happen to that work, and you could kind of cut it up into a quadrant of sorts, I'm so fine with that, because, the intention for showing that work in the way that it was shown as almost like this kind of relief or freeze. Well, it is, traditionally a mural. And then that's what the name of the exhibition, Mariflage, came from, was, like raised and then directly onto the roof. So I can't imagine like if it was more of a kind of, sold to, I don't know, someone in Turak, that they're going to like, make the pool room into some kind of like, ancient sort of basilica. But, it'd be cool if they did.
Yeah, mariflage is a conservation term as well, where you probably know this, but take murals or things on wooden panels or anything that's on a surface and take it off and then stick it onto another surface. So it's, very interesting in seeing it pop up in artwork. And I suppose with that work, because, it was so arresting on the ceiling, in future iterations of that, or, if it was cut up and distributed, is that something that you would like it to still be on a ceiling or, on a sort of wall surface rather than, say being stretched into a traditional stretcher?
I don't really care so much. Like, I think that it's quite nice. I remember reading this essay. I think it was Helen Hughes was writing about this friend of mine, Lauren's exhibition a few years ago, about a lot of the work was on the ceiling or on the floor, and you had this sort of like linear appreciation of experiencing an artwork where you look down and up rather than left to right. And I don't know if that's like, I think that was just like a nice idea that potentially could have informed, the way that I wanted to show something raised. But I've always wanted to do something directly onto a ceiling or a wall. I just couldn't really do it at bus in the time that I had. But, like the way that is painted, and it's the same as the mural that the kids and I did in Port Hedland, where that was on the floor. So people were sitting on the canvas and there was, a lot of dirt and hair and just shit everywhere. And that wasn't, much, like it didn't really have, the orientation obviously was landscape, and the concept was this sort of loose appreciation of what landscape is. So I was just like, it can be like that rock over there, some graffiti, something that's essentially not portraiture figurative. And with the bust work, it was sort of done the same. Like I was working on the floor, so I was kind of, the perspective and orientation wasn't really important at all. It kind of came in this sort of like almost, wrapping paper kind of printed quality. So when you're looking at it up, or if you were looking at it down, you're kind of walking around the space and sort of seeing things in a particular way to actually look, rather than if it was shown on a wall. I think there's this sort of, inherent kind of expectation that the orientation of objects or things has to sort of be, top down, left, that sort of thing. So if that was shown on a wall, it would kind of lose that agency. But then I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just a bit weird sometimes, because I've had, with older works I used to do, which were paintings of reflected surfaces, not, like there were mistakes when people would sort of show them upside down. And, that has popped up again recently with the last show that I had. And I don't really care, but it's almost like what people want to see. And if that looks good for them, then, that's cool too.
Because it was interesting because we did see that exhibition at Sutton just before lockdown. I think it was on the last, just as it was the last day of freedom before lockdown. So we just squished it in. But we did notice, the works going around the edge of the tacking edge. Yeah. And we were like, well, how did you paint them while they were unstretched and then you stretch them
or do you just paint all the way around the stretcher, slowly turning it?
Yeah. So it's interesting.
Most of them were unstretched and then stretched to, Yeah. I guess it was more conceptually relevant that they could continue forever because there wasn't really a focal point in terms of composition of work, even though, some of them were, these quite sort of, like ocean static, all these people sort of in a crowd. But I guess with some of them I did stretched and then some unstretched, but mostly unstretched. So they were sort of wrapped around and then it lost a bit of information on the side. I didn't sort of like charge it so it was so conceptual, like the whole canvas from the front and the back is covered. It wasn't really like pushed that far. But yeah, I guess, I don't really like, I actually really don't like edges that are painted. I don't know why. Like, I think it's a bit like, I don't know.
Well, you're introducing a lot of stresses on it. So from our perspective, we're like crack city on those turnover edges.
Definitely. There is a bit of crack city going on in there. I think, I feel like, yeah, it's interesting because, I have had works as well that were unstretched and then people want to sort of have them against something. And I'm like, yeah, do whatever you want. And then they're like, but we're going to lose that bit. And I'm like, so what? Like, so, I think it is interesting seeing how, it's the same thing of like the way I handle works or sort of can sort of bend to, say, okay, if you want it stretched, you're going to lose some of it. Or, that's the way it was done. And I think that, is a crack that bad? Like if something's sort of cracked on an edge, it sort of makes sense. I mean, in a sky's blue kind of way, or maybe not, but yeah.
No, it does.
Well, it's kind of interesting because it's almost like you're bringing in like a sculptural element to it. So it's almost like you're making an image and then you're thinking about it in a three-dimensional way, but also then framing that image by actively deciding the boundaries of that stretcher. So it's almost like the stretching is almost part of your image making as well, that you're kind of creating these scenes out of a larger, like
it's
a director.
Making me think of like, with like 18th century portraits and things where they're like, oh, let's cut this bit off. It will fit better on the wall that way. Or like, it's like that's been done for so long that people are constantly reshaping.
And I think that's great. And it's kind of almost like reverse psychology with like an artist doing that and thinking that that's like fine, as opposed to sort of someone who buys it and wants to sort of make it fit inside this really kind of particular room. It becomes like interior design rather than kind of, like artwork appreciation. And that's fine. Yeah. Like, I guess like that interest of, creating like this sort of like armature that sits within a canon of painting, I wasn't so interested in before, or I can kind of move in and around that, for whatever the work needs, which is why I was like a lot of the time taking it or not even having a stretcher at all. So these sort of works were more, I guess, mural-like by having a very small space between it and the wall.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And I think like the mapping those sort of perspectives of yours and like as they change and getting that initial sense of like where you're thinking about it going in the future. And, I think some artists like have a really strong desire for like, no, you can't have it like this and you can't have it like that. So, that sort of understanding of there being flexibility through it, but there are consequences to the, the choices that are made about it.
I mean, the thing that I kind of am not, the thing that I sort of am not particularly kind of encouraging is framing. I think that sort of adds this sort of like unnecessary sculptural element or boundary between the work and place. And I guess that was sort of, looked at when I was installing that last show where everything sort of butted up against each other and it had this idea of like endlessness, which was also, relating to that idea of an expanded kind of field for concept. But yeah, sometimes I think that, like, I just remember like being a kid and my mum and dad, we had artwork kind of all over the house, and they would go and get things framed, and like they'd be like, ooh, I think we'll choose this one. And it was just like these fucking loud frames. Like, it's kind of cool. Like, it does definitely suit spaces, but like I said, they do kind of, interfere with having a collection that sort of needs to sort of be consolidated by, whatever reason, less dynamic by putting this kind of border around it.
Yeah, I definitely remember that with my parents as well, just like going to the framing shop and getting like red mount board. It's like, like a blue frame and red mount board. Thank you so much for chatting with us. It's been really interesting and fabulous to get your perspective on.
And it's very refreshing, actually, to see, especially with such a kind of traditional imagery or technique, but actually have kind of very non-traditional, I guess, approaches or attitudes towards the work. So
Totally, yeah. I quite like, I think that's really cool and interesting as well, because, conservation could be, something that pinpoints where the work needs to be, and if it's like realistic or important for it to sort of stay there, rather than, like time and, depletion or destroying something. So I think that's kind of cool. Like, if I get something conserved, I might say it needs to be 10 years older than this, for the 50 years. And that's kind of interesting. But yeah, it's cool. Thanks for having me to talk to.